Hi, editing Chris here to tell you that this video is all opinions. This is my opinion of Dawntrail. Um, I'm not trying to tell anybody they can't enjoy it. I'm not trying to tell anybody that they have to enjoy it. This is just how I felt at the end. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Sharlayan forum. My name is Chris, and today I am appearing before you on camera for the first time because today I want to talk about Dawntrail. I want to talk about what I thought of the MSQ. It's been 3 weeks now since early access, and I think that I've finally, like many others, have gathered in my thoughts enough to not make a sort of knee-jerk reaction. And I've sat on it long enough and watched some other people play through it after I finished my playthrough. And I think now I've finally got my opinion straight enough that I'm ready to share it. So just some context, I did start server up morning of early access. First thing I did was level Viper. I did not start the MSQ immediately. But as soon as I got Viper to 90, I jumped right in. I finished the MSQ, I believe, on the Monday following early access, early that morning, I think. It might have been Sunday night, I can't remember. A couple of days, so probably 40 hours. And, just sort of my overall thoughts, just to sort of get them out of the way first. I'm going to sort of break this up into like zones and then pros and cons and sort of the story beats. So overall, the content so far in Dawntrail has been unbelievable. The actual battle content, dungeons, trials, extremes, all of them have been insane. It's probably the best battle content on release that I've seen since I started playing this game in A Realm Reborn. The zones and the music are unbelievable. I'm here right now in Tulialal. It's stunning. The graphics update looks incredible. Everything just looks so beautiful. The game has never looked better than this. The music is also really great. Soken never misses, but especially this time, it just feels like there's something different about the zones and the music this time around that feels so incredibly good. And a lot of it probably has to do with the graphical update. I mean, the game has just never looked quite this nice. The promise of the content that they're going to deliver in the future, the things like the Shades Triangle exploration zone, the Savage Raids, Ultimates, all of that feels incredibly exciting because of how good the content that we have in the game right now is designed. Everything that we have right now just points to all of these areas of the game flourishing in the future. And that's really exciting as a longtime player, because that's why I'm still here, right? Is to play that content. The exploration of sort of a new global culture that we're having in Dawntrail is really exciting, and it's cool. And I'm sure I've seen the sentiment a lot on Twitter, at least. The people who come from these cultures, South American, Southeast Asian, the things that are referenced in this game, they seem really happy with the way that their cultures are being represented. And that's important. And I think that it's really good that they're getting this now. We've had the sort of European fantasy and Heavensward. We had the Japanese and the Eastern sort of fantasies with basically the rest of the expansions. And so it's fun to go to a new place and to see a new group of people. And it's exciting. It's really cool. I don't want to go into my overall cons right away, just because I don't want to sort of push too much into the beginning of the video. And you're going to see me alt tab a few times here probably. I have my notes pulled up on my other monitor that I sort of just took as I was playing. So let's just start with our first group of zones, Urqopacha and Kozama'uka. So I did Urqopacha first. I know that this was a split zone where you could go to either one that you wanted to go to. But I chose to do this one first, and I think that's the right choice objectively. I don't know, obviously you could disagree with me there, but this zone is really cool. The huge mountain in the background is really fascinating. When I thought of Dawntrail exploring these new parts of the world, this is what I pictured in my head. This totally foreign land, that we've never had something like this in the game to date. And so it's just really exciting to see something like this. So just to sort of get into what I thought about these, this zone in particular, Urqopacha in particular, it starts slow, but it's the first zone of an expansion that's always going to start slow. So I was sort of used to that to a certain degree. The Pelu Pelu as a group of people are really fun. You know, they when they first talked about them being traders, I was a little worried that they were going to fall into like this really weird, gross, like pushy salesman stereotype, and they sort of do, but they also don't cross the line with it. They know how to take no for an answer, which makes them a little bit more redeemable. And they're not just like this weird, gross scumbag group of people that are only interested in money, right? Which would have been not a very good characterization to have. I think that the culture is cool. This culture that revolves around like mezcal and the alpacas and this sort of trading culture, bartering culture is really neat. However, I think that a lot of the quests in this zone ended up failing because of it. That trading sequence that sort of outlined this whole first section of this zone was dreadfully boring to start off with. It didn't get much better in the next zone, but it just sort of, it didn't feel like I was hitting the ground running. It felt like I hit the ground struggling to crawl with 2 broken legs. It just didn't feel very fulfilling to do those trade quests, despite the fact that the zone itself is really fun and really cool and the people are interesting. Those trade quests and this, the overall framing of why we were here doing it, it just started to overstay its welcome a little bit. And I think that that's a theme that we'll see, in my opinion, continues through the rest of the expansion. Particularly, there's way too many fetch quests in these early zones. Way too many. The stakes just feel bottom of the barrel, astronomically low. And I know that they said that this was supposed to be sort of a summer break vacation expansion, but it just felt almost to the point of like, we're going backwards. And I get it, you know, these people don't know who we are, but we are the warrior of light. You know, we've saved the world from apocalypse literally countless times. And I'm tracking down an alpaca for a random character that I've known for 2 patches who is going to be the next queen of this land. It feels very like, I know people throw around the term like ludonarrative dissonance a lot, but like it feels very disconnected. And it just feels super boring, to be honest with you. But I think that that's sort of a consequence of the fact that they did a split zone start. So if we go to the next possible option, which was Kozama'uka, we can talk more about that. It's an unfortunate side effect, I think, of when you give people the option to pick which zone they're going to do first, you sort of force the game to not do anything important for the first 3 levels, because you're ostensibly going to be doing, you know, a level and a half or 2 levels in the first zone, and then a level and a half or 2 levels in the second zone. And when you split them, unfortunately, that means that nothing interesting can happen, right? Because you can't really push the plot forward if it means that somebody's going to come in and completely miss it because they went into the opposite zone. So the result is that these first 2 zones feel very fetch questy, very boring, very MMO, right? It doesn't feel like a game. It doesn't feel like an RPG, rather. It feels like a game world designed just to be a game. Which is not that interesting. But what they do is they split the zones in half, right? So this is something they've done in the past, where you revisit a zone later and it has some more interesting stuff, because at that point the 2 paths have converged and you're on a singular story track from that point forward. But unfortunately, I think it happens a little bit late in Dawntrail. It happens to the point where I was already starting to hit a wall by the time I got to the 91 dungeon, and it feels like that dungeon is super slow coming out. You know, I tried to level 2 jobs through the MSQ. I was doing Viper and Paladin and switching back and forth to share XP on them. And by the time I got to the level 91 dungeon, my Viper was already level 93. And so I was completely flabbergasted by how long it took to get to the 91 dungeon. It just feels like it took way too long to get there, and there's too many quests in this early split story section. The people here in Kozama'uka are remarkably less interesting than the Pelu Pelu because they're just reused. The Hanu Hanu and the Moblins, it's just a recycled, reskinned Beastman tribe from previous expansions, and unfortunately that's just not that interesting. Their cultures, despite being different from their other counterparts, are not that remarkably different, and frankly I just started to get bored at this point. By the time I got to this zone, I felt like I was ready to be gone. So maybe maybe it actually would be better to do this one first and then do Urqopacha, because you at least get the benefit of having the Pelu Pelu be new to you, right? So maybe something to consider. But I will say that the second half of Urqopacha, where you come back and you visit with the Yakhoi, the giants, way more interesting, way more interesting. Their culture and their traditions of this sort of like everlasting life as long as you're remembered, and the design of that culture was really cool and really fascinating, and their story was way more interesting just quest wise than these first 2.5 zones, I guess I'll say. Hey buddy, you being loud? I'm sorry if you hear my cat in the background. He's a Siamese and he's very talkative today. But anyway, the Yakhoi, vastly more interesting. Their culture is way more palatable and way more deep than these other cultures are given. They have this entire structure around life and death and the afterlife, and it feels like they were actually written, whereas these other cultures kind of just feel like they were given quests and some dialogue. It doesn't quite add up. And again, and we start to overstay our welcome here, just too much. So moving on, the next place we go to is Yak T'el. Now we do have the 93 dungeon and trial, Valley Garmanda. Great fights, not much to mention there. Like I said at the top, the dungeons and the trials are all incredible. Way above, a totally cut above what we normally get on an expansion launch. So great fights. And that leads us into this zone here, Yak T'el. This is where I started to hit a absolute concrete wall personally. I could not have cared less about the story than I did when I arrived here. The combat was just not there. The story revolving around collecting the ingredients to make this dish to complete the trial was insane. I just started to get so bored. The reveal of the arbiter or whatever he's called here being Wukalamat's real father was like the most contrived, meaningless thing ever. It comes up and then goes away and it's never mentioned again. It serves no purpose. So yeah, at this point I was pretty low. I was just not very engaged with this story at this point in time. The backstory that they have of Galul Jaja coming together and uniting the two people here, two groups of people here, it's nice, but it serves no purpose in the greater scheme of things other than to just say the objective is to unite people, which has been the whole point the entire time up to this point. That was always Wukalamat's objective, and so this idea that it needed to be explained further is a little bit, I don't want to say contrived or insulting, but something like that. Unfortunately, this only gets worse when we get to the second half of this zone in Mamuk. So when we get to Mamuk, number one, the zone is incredibly beautiful. It's insanely good looking. The sort of like unpenetrable canopy of trees being in the dark is really cool. And it feels like the first place we've been that is sort of alien, right? It feels like a place that is truly different. And that's really cool. it almost sort of feels like the Raktika Greatwood a little bit from Shadowbringers, but like it's distinctly different in its own ways. The Mamuja culture is fun to explore. The fact that they're like super standoffish at first and then slowly come around to us is fun. Well, I say slowly, but it's kind of nothing and then all at once. But unfortunately, this zone, I think, is where the story falls apart. It sucks because at the beginning of this zone, it starts to get really interesting because we start to learn about the blessed siblings and how they're artificially created using this method, and it's like super horrendous. And all the ones that don't make it are stored in this dungeon that we have to go to and clear as the 95 dungeon. And it's really fascinating to sort of explore that. But unfortunately, this zone is also where all the pretense of the expansion are just completely thrown away. It's absolutely discarded. The contest between the Dawn Servant hopefuls is completely abandoned here. Urqopacha is now the only one in the running. So duh. The conflict between the Scions that we were promised is completely abandoned here. Not that it was very compelling up to this point anyway. And, you know, we get through this and then we get to the coronation ceremony where Urqopacha is going to be made Dawn Servant. And then she asks Kona to be the second, two heads, so to speak. And it's just like, okay, and, you know, there's just not really a lot to be said about it. It just sort of all happens. It makes the entire, because this sort of wraps up around like the level 95, 96 area. It sort of just makes the whole 5 levels that we had previously feel like they were just sort of for nothing, because there was never really any threat that Urqopacha wasn't going to be the Dawn Servant, right? She was always going to be the Dawn Servant. Kona was always going to be involved somehow. He was always going to be the right-hand man or her advisor or something, because it's obvious that they're the only 2 characters that are written with any sort of nuance at all. Bakul Jaja is just like this comic book villain who is just horrible all the time, and despite the fact that he gets his redemption later, which I'll talk about, it's just too little too late. And Zerulja is, you know, this warmonger Emmett Selk type where he's like, oh, well, in order to have peace, I have to just destroy everything, which works for Emmett Selk because he's this sort of tragic character who just wants to see his people be brought back to their full form. But for Zerulja, it doesn't make any sense because he's just a guy. He's just a guy who lives in this place and thinks that they're better than everyone else. And so he just wants to kill everybody in the world and subjugate them because that's what he thinks he should do, which is a really bad motivation for a villain, right? And so it all just sort of dumpster fires off a cliff into this zone, like the last like conflict in the zone where you fight the clone of Galul Jaja. You know, it's sort of the bow that wraps up the present on this half of the story is exceptionally unsatisfying, which leads us into Shaaloani and the second half of the story. So with Shaaloani or Shaaloani or however we're going to decide to say it as a group, aesthetically, this zone is super cool. It's super fun to have this sort of Wild West cowboy darn tootin' 6-shooting thing. It's super interesting, and it's a fun new thing that we've never had, right? Again, we're continuing that trend of Dawntrail having these new experiences that feel very exciting, and it's true, you know, it holds true for this. The music is awesome, but literally everything else about this zone sucks. The quests here feel less than meaningless. It is truly, this is the point where I started to skip cutscenes. I just couldn't bring myself to care about this framed bandit, outlaw, corrupt sheriff thing. I just was so disconnected from it at this point that I would watch the first couple minutes of a cutscene to make sure that nothing super interesting was happening, and then I would just skip it, which unfortunately did bite me And the last cutscene, because it starts off with, we're all friends, we're going to build a train, and then we're going to get on the train and go somewhere. And then I'm like, who cares about this train thing? I skip it, and I'm jump scared with the body of Galul Jaja. So I had to go back to my inn room and watch those cutscenes because I couldn't possibly understand how we went from finishing a train to being invaded by the future force from the giant ominous lightning bubble who brought their robot mech warriors to kill the king of the world. The fact that those two things happen directly next to each other is the most insane story jump I've ever seen in a video game, I think. And it could not have been less expected, which I guess is good in the sense that we're averting our expectations, but wow, is it bad for the overall pacing of this experience. And it just it comes out of nowhere, you know, it's zero warning, zero pretense. And it sort of just feels like at this point that they loaded the pacing into a cannon and fired it off into the sun. It's a complete mess narratively. But this does sort of wrap up with us coming back to this zone. We finish up modifying the train and getting it ready to head into this lightning bubble. And we storm Vanguard, which is the 97 dungeon. Great dungeon, really cool bosses. I think it's probably the best dungeon of the bunch. And the second boss of that dungeon especially was really fun the first time. It's still fun, but it's been awesome. That dungeon's cool. The gear coming out of it's really cool. That was a high point, I think, in terms of content. So that leads us into Heritage Found. So when we get to Heritage Found, I was immediately stoked on this zone. Aesthetically, this zone could not be cooler. This sort of land encased by this bubble of time-altering dimension overlap lightning. It's cool, right? Narratively, it feels cool, and the architecture is really cool. The pretense is really cool, but it starts to fall apart about halfway through, not unlike this MSQ as a whole. It sucks because at the beginning of this, the story feels like it's locking in, right? You're like, oh, here we go. You know, it feels like we're picking up. It feels like we're getting into some really interesting stuff with the Zoral Jaw being the king. And there's this time dilation that's happened where he's been here for 30 years and he's developed this insane military. And it's only been days for us, but for him, he's had a lifetime to fight and grow and become stronger. And it's this really cool way to sort of like anime progress a villain in one swipe of a pen, right? Unfortunately, there's some stuff that gets introduced here that amounts to basically nothing. The first thing that comes to mind is Urqopacha's surrogate mother. I don't even remember her name. That's how little impact it had. Was on the train, came here, and has been here for 30 years, has grown old, and dies. And I assume that that's supposed to be like a super touching and emotionally charged moment. It was not. This character is introduced and killed within like 1 hour, and it just basically means nothing when it happens. It serves the purpose of explaining regulators, the little devices that these people wear on their heads and souls, but that's really all it does. It's an emotional plot point that could have been developed that is regulated instead to just an exposition dump, which feels really bad. It sort of feels like that this zone kind of starts the story that they actually wanted to tell. This story of an overlapping dimension with a cruel king and a queen who is like this tragic figure who wants to help her people, but in order to do so, she has to side with the cruel king because he's gathering the materials that her people need to survive. And there's this dystopian, 1984 style technology that controls everything that they do and decides their future for them and erases them when they die. It's this fascinating group of ideas that come together into one zone in the entire expansion that feels like it's super well paced and feels like it's, getting somewhere. But Man, just in time for it to feel like we're getting on our feet to start running, we immediately trip over our shoelaces again. Um, because it's just not that interesting, unfortunately. It falls apart. And we get into this place where we're sort of just seeing these events happen. And I think the introduction of Sphene as a character is sort of the beginning of the end. Um, she's introduced and she's made to be this, like, again, sympathetic character, but her motivations are obviously completely evil. It's never, the pretense is not even pretended to be that she actually wants to help us. From the very minute she's introduced, she creeped me out. There was something about her that felt unsettling, which I guess makes sense because she wants to harvest the souls of all living people in order to keep her memory bank alive. And it's just, it's impossible to root for somebody like that and to feel good about it, right? But we do get to solution 9 here, so let's talk about that. So solution 9 is introduced at this point, and I really like solution 9. I think it's a very visually distinct area. It's very cool. The music is nice to listen to. I can see myself just sitting here, between raids and stuff like that and just enjoying it, right? It's a nice city. It's a little big. I think it's unnecessarily large, to be honest with you. Like this whole section down here, I hope they do something with it. Otherwise, it's completely wasted. Same goes for this upper section here. The Arcadian, the raid tier, it takes place over here. And this is our vendor trade-in stuff. So we'll see. They might have some opportunity to flesh some of this out. But as of right now, it's a little bit empty. It's kind of a ghost town. I think that it's cool, but again, the story surrounding it just falls flat. We get a lot more backstory here about regulators and how the souls are utilized, but it's just not that interesting. We get introduced to Kafkiwa, Aaronville's mother, inside of the little robot thing, which again, as soon as we get to the point where we're talking to Otis about the Endless, my brain was instantly like, oh, well, Kafkiwa's been dead the whole time and that she's just an Endless operating inside of this robot. So that plot point pretty much went right out the window as soon as I figured it out. And it just, again, it feels a little contrived, right? We arrive in this place and we get told all these things and then we're just like, okay, well, let's just go kill the king anyway. And again, Otis, I think, is an interesting character because he kind of forces us to rethink what we have thought about Sphene up to this point, where he's like, oh, she's this super compassionate queen who cares about her people so much and she'd do anything for them. And the reason that she's sided with Zoraal is because she has to in order to keep her people safe. And you're like, oh, maybe I was wrong. Maybe she's not this horrible, creepy anime robot monster. But then he's like, LOL JK, everybody that she's keeping alive has actually been dead forever, and it's just this weird data bank repository of their memories and their brains, and she's gonna harvest everyone in the world, and also she's been dead the whole time. So he just sort of dumps it all out on the table, and the illusion of Sphene being a good guy was maintained for like 5 quests, and that just dies instantly. The stuff about Zoraal son, Galulja, is, it's fine. They do the whole thing later on where he inherits the permissions of the king in the Solution 9 systems, and like maybe they'll do something with that, but something tells me they probably won't. It's probably just going to be a thread that goes nowhere. And I think that at this point I was like hard checking out. It didn't get it didn't get quite as bad as the last zone, which I'll talk about here in a second, but I was struggling at this point. Thankfully, the 99 dungeon and the 99 trial against Zoraal are both very good. The dungeon has some weird pulls. I know a lot of people have been complaining about that. Like it's like forced single pulls, and the pull with like the 2 Cyclopses and the turtle sucks, man. That's a terrible dungeon pull. But it's fine. You know, all the dungeons are really good. The bosses are fun. The 99 trial is incredible. The extreme of that trial is even more incredible. So yeah, I mean, that leads us into the last zone, Living Memory. And here we are, the last zone of the expansion, Living Memory. I'm just going to put it out there. This is the worst zone that Square Enix has ever designed in Final Fantasy XIV. Sorry. It's remarkably uninteresting. The story is contrived. It got to the point where I was out loud saying to myself, I don't care about this, and skipping cutscenes. They attempt to do some characterization with Sphene and the people that are here. They attempt to bring Kryl in at the last second and give her some plot. She was pitched all the way back in the promotion material as she's finally going to be a part of the adventure, and she's going to be a scion like us for the first time. And she does nothing for 99 levels, and then she comes in here and meets her parents, and then we kill them. It's fascinating how horrible this zone is. It's insane to me that they would build all of this stuff and create this beautiful place, and then you literally wipe it all out and turn it into a gray wasteland by the time the zone is over. And I get it. I understand that it's this idea of letting go, right? That's what the whole point of the zone is. And the point of the Endless is that things die, and, we all are going to die. And that's the whole point, is that nothing lasts forever. And it's our responsibility to understand that as living people and know when it's time to let go. And I get it. That's a poignant thing, and that's even a cogent point that they could make with the story that they wrote for this zone. But unfortunately, the pacing is utterly dog shit. It's just bad, and it drags out for so long. I mean, this zone could have been this idea of this artificial heaven where all of these memories go to live forever in eternity and everything's perfect. This could have been an entire expansion, but instead they pack it all down into what amounts to 1 or 2 levels of quests, and it's just not good. We come to this place and we meet these people, and the idea is that it's supposed to humanize the Endless to us and create this sympathy that we have for them. And then we're supposed to feel bad about turning off the server. But at this point, I was so ready to just be done with this. I literally didn't even think about it. I skipped the cutscene, walked up, hit the button, skip cutscene, don't care. The zone's dark now. And, and it's especially bad when we get to the end and Kafkiwa is, okay, time to turn me off. And Aaronville's all upset and he's staying behind. And I know that I'm supposed to feel some sort of trepidation in that moment, but I just didn't. I didn't care. At this point, the story had overstayed its welcome. I was just completely over it. And, that leads into the level 100 dungeon, Alexandria, which I like. The music in Alexandria is an absolute banger. It's a really good track. And the level 100 trial is fine. But unfortunately, for some reason beyond my comprehension, they made Urqopacha even more of a Mary Sue. She jumps in at the last second and saves us from Sphene and the trial. And it feels so backwards. I'm not sure what they were thinking there. I get that Urqopacha is the main character of Dawntrail. We are not. And that's fine. It's fine that they want to have characters take the spotlight and we sort of play a supporting role. That's totally cool, right? We've had 10 years of story all about us, and now we get to this new place with these new people, and we've got a new main character, and we are playing a supporting role. But the problem is that Urqopacha kind of grows, she starts as this really idealistic little kid type character, and she ends up as being this like idealistic little kid type of queen. There's not really a huge overlap there. Her and Sphene, I think, are supposed to be foils to each other, is the idea, but it doesn't make any sense because Sphene's motivations are like just intrinsically evil. She is going to wipe out the entire planet to keep her people alive, which you can't justify. You can't justify it. You know, again, it's like an Emmett Selk situation, but the difference is that Emmett Selk had all this buildup. He had all of the Ascian stuff going on behind the scenes for all of these expansions leading up to Shadowbringers. He had all of the promise of Endwalker going forward. He had all of the Zodiark and Hydaelyn. He had all of this interplay for 10 years of story, well, 8 years of story buildup to get to Emmett Selk, right? Sphene, very similar motivations. She plans to wipe out an entire swath of people so that her people can live, which at its root is the same exact motivation that the Ascians have. But she doesn't matter. She's only been here for an hour or two by the time you get to this point, maybe 4 or 5, whatever, however long it takes you to get through it. And we don't care about her, right? Like, we know she's a robot. We know that she's fake. We know that she's not actually a real being. We know that she existed thousands of years ago in the shard that was Alexandria, but now she's a floating string of data that's in this big tower that can just be plugged into a robot, and that becomes Sphene. And it's supposed to be this really like humanizing story where we feel bad about deleting the memories of the dead, but at the same time, the game is preaching to you about letting go, and then it wants to make you feel bad about doing it. I'm just not really sure what they were getting at, but you know, again, I don't know what they were thinking. The fact that this zone stays dead is really unfortunate because it was very pretty. Super cool design, and you know, I just really, you know, this is what we have. It's just a little disappointing. So let's just talk about overall closing thoughts. You know, overall, I think that Dawntrail does a good job of setting a sort of foundation for the world of Tyrell, right? It's got this extremely deep world. It's really intense backstory as far as the world building is concerned. You know, we get these beautiful zones with this incredible music, and there's even like little glimmers of hope sprinkled around in the MSQ where you're like, oh, this is going to get interesting because they're finally telling me something that has some interest. It has some conflict. It has some juice, you know, a little bit of grease. But it just, every time I think it's going to go up, it immediately crashes on itself and burns. The pacing, I think, is the major issue. The pacing of this expansion is by far the worst pacing I have ever seen in a Final Fantasy expansion. It's probably even worse than A Realm Reborn, which is insane to think about because A Realm Reborn has 50 levels and this is only 10. I don't know, maybe that's too harsh. Maybe A Realm Reborn is still a little slower than this, but at least A Realm Reborn is kind of, you know, you're laying the foundation, right? You feel that, and it pays off 4 times in a row. This feels like we're building a foundation, but I don't know how they're going to pay off on it, because this idea of a story in 2 parts, right? Where you have the Rite of Succession is one story, and then you have the Alexandria story. And those are 2 completely separate things. And the only reason that they're connected is because they both take place on Tyrell and the characters exist in the same story. But I think that design is actually evident that Square Enix might have not known what to do here. They might have not known how to follow up the Hydaelyn and Zodiark saga. And so they did a little A/B testing, you know. That's sort of my running theory, is that they didn't really know what to write for this. It feels like the second story of Alexandria and Solution 9 and Heritage Found, that feels like the story that they wanted to tell. It's way more interesting. if we're just going off the pacing of those two, like the second half of the game is way better paced than the first half. It's still not great, but it's better, right? And I think that it's unfortunate that they didn't have enough there yet, is what I think happened. They knew they had to get an expansion out. They knew that it was going to be hard to follow up this 10-year saga, and they could have gone two ways. They could have gone the direction of flesh out Tyral, flesh out Tuliolal, and make an entire expansion about the people and their sort of struggle to come together, and their, maybe there's desperate factions that are sort of fighting with each other and sort of warring for the throne. And we have this, Urqopacha could still be a character. She's the daughter of the current Dawn servant, and she kind of comes to us and she's like, I need your help. Things are falling apart in Tyral, and I know that you're this super powerful warrior, and we need you to come help us, right? And that could have been its own expansion, where you go through these, zones, and you help these people, and you gather them up, and you make them see that uniting against a threat is the only real way. And you could have even had, at the end, the Alexandria thing happen, where they're attacked, and that's sort of the catalyst, right, that brings them all together. Or you could have gone down the path of another overlapping dimension thing like the first, and we have this bubble that appears out of nowhere, and she comes to the Urqopacha, shows up, and she's like, hey, there's this crazy shit happening, and I need somebody, like, I've heard that you have experience with traveling through the Etheric Sea and all this stuff, and we think that there's something similar going on, so we need you to come help us figure this out. And so you come to Tyral and you help her figure it out, and the rest plays out like it does, but stretched out. And I think that independently, those two would have been better expansions. It's unfortunate, but I think cramming them together, do a little A/B test to figure out which path they want to go down in the future was probably the goal. What just happened? I think that A/B testing, trying to figure out which experience people would have preferred, was sort of the end goal. And I don't know if it comes together very well. So now, as promised, I'll kind of go over my overall pros and cons of the expansion. You know what? I'll even drag my my little notepad onto the screen here. So again, so far the content of Dawntrail has been incredible. The dungeons feel meaningful. The expert dungeons are actually like a little bit difficult, which is fun, and that's been a good change of pace. The zone design and the music is as good as it's ever been. I think that jobs are generally in a pretty good place. I don't have everything leveled yet, but I do have, a few. I've got one of everything except for healer. I'm still working on that. That sort of my least played role. But I'm very pleased with where jobs are, generally speaking. There's a few that have some issues, and I think that they need to be ironed out. There's some buffs that need to happen and some nerfs that need to happen, but I think that the overall balance and the overall gameplay loop of most jobs is in a good spot. Viper and Pictomancer are both super fun. They both feel very well designed. Both of them have issues, nothing's perfect, but I think that they're going to be jobs that people stick on. Trials, Extremes, content overall, best we've ever gotten on an expansion launch, probably ever. The normal raids are super good, and they leave a lot of room to see where Savage mechanics are going to come in, and I'm incredibly excited to do Savage this tier. Like I said before, the promise of the content that we have coming with like cosmic exploration, the shaded triangle, the alliance raids, especially as a Final Fantasy XI player, I'm unbelievably stoked for the alliance raids. Just can't wait. A lot of the ancillary characters in the story are pretty good. Kona's great. Galul Jaja is incredible. Urqopacha is fine. I mean, she's an ancillary character, but and a lot of them have been huge hits with the fans. Kona is really popular. Bakul Jaja is probably a little too popular. If you know, you know. The world building is super deep. It sets up a lot in the future, which I can appreciate. Like I said before, the exploration of these new cultures is really fun, and the graphics update is incredible. The game has never looked better than it does right now. So cons, like I said, I think the characters and sort of the overarching story are okay, but the fine details are just really unsatisfying. They leave a lot on the table, and it just feels like there's something missing, right? Like something is not firing correctly. The story in two parts, like I said, is fine, but I think it was designed really poorly. It's very clear to me that they were trying two different things and they wanted to see what the feedback was like. It feels like this is an A/B test. Somebody, like, I work in advertising, and it felt to me like I could literally see the line where they were like, part two, you know, and it just felt so distracting, and it pulls you out of it so quickly. And with that, pacing is a terrible issue in this expansion. I think that a lot of the quest lines and a lot of the story beats just overstay their welcome. They're here for too long, and things drag out and just feel so boring by the time you get to the end of them that you don't care. And it's unfortunately, it sort of happens individually in each half, but by the time you get to Living Memory, you are, I'll say by the time I got to Living Memory, I was so out of it. I didn't care at all about what was going on. All I cared about was getting to the end so that I could do what I wanted to do and just play the game, right? I just wanted to play the game, which I think is an interesting point, because I've been playing this game for 10 years and I haven't wanted to play the game as much as I want to play it now, probably since like Heavensward. I don't know, maybe Shadowbringers. I've never been as excited to play the game as I am to play it now. It's like all I want to do. And I think that shows that the content design is so incredible and so meaningful to longtime players, but the story, man, I just bounced off of it so hard. Which I think that even when people compare it to something like Stormblood, which was like, you know, up to this point, sort of the worst expansion is what people say. Man, Stormblood just clears this like by a football field. It's insane. I think that a lot of it has to do with this note I made here, comparative failings. You know, they have this, up to this point, the past 10 years, we've had this design where we sort of set up these emotional bowling pins and then we knock them down, right? You know, we get this buildup of these characters and this idea, and then it sort of gets yanked away, but that's good. You know, that's how writing is supposed to be. You know, things that come to mind are like Menphilia, or Horsefart, or, you know, there's so much, or like Emmett Selk, again, to talk about him for the 1 bazillionth time. We get these buildups where we're with these characters for a while and we start to understand them and we start to grow with them and sympathize with them in Emmett's case. And then we sort of come crashing back down into this realization that, like, oh, you know, they're dead, like Menphilia or Horsefant, like they were killed, you know, and that's, well, you know, in Menphilia's case, yeah, but that sort of brings you back down into this very humanizing experience, and it's relatable, right? And you feel very emotional. But in this expansion, those emotional moments instead were just sort of replaced with moments of frustration for me, where, again, like in Living Memory, where I'm supposed to feel something when I'm deleting these people. You know, these are people that have lived thousands of years inside of this simulation, and they think they're going to live forever, and I just walk up and yank the power cord out. And I'm sure that that's supposed to make you feel something, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be done. And I think that that's just a failing on the pacing and the writing, which comparatively, it makes this expansion feel way worse than others. The story feels pretty lazy compared to the previous saga. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with that split, that A/B testing. We got the promise that this would be sort of a relaxed summer vacation vibe. And like, obviously we knew that there was going to be some shenanigans that we would have to deal with. But I think that what makes this one really egregious is that this story could have taken place anywhere, right? You could have put this story in Sharlayan. You could have put this story in Ishgard, you could have put it anywhere and just replaced the characters with characters from those expansions, and it would have worked. And just replace Alexandrians with Alligans, and like, boom, you know, it's done. And so the promise of this new pace, this more relaxed pace, this new sort of vibe, just really didn't come true. It was, I'm not going to say they advertised it falsely or anything, because I'm sure they thought that that's what they were going to deliver, but you know, it just sort of ended up being, this story could have been anywhere. It just happened to be on this island. The Scions were completely inconsequential. You know, we got this sort of lead up in the promotional material where the Scions are going to be having this sort of contest, and you know, you were going to be fighting back and forth with your fellow Scions to decide the fate of Tyrol, but like, no. You know, that's just not what happened. It's especially egregious that like Grahatia and Y'shtola show up, and they just like, oh, well, we've been here for 10 minutes, but we figured out everything that's wrong, and we know the solution to your problems. And it just, it's so dumb. It's very contrived. Kryl, again, is sort of touted as this, like, she's going to finally get her moment in the sun, and not really. I mean, we get some backstory about the fact that she's actually from the shard that Alexandria comes from, and her earring that she got was not a green mage tease, but was instead actually a USB drive. And it's just like, you know, it feels so lame to have this build up in your head of the Scions not agreeing, and like, maybe we even kill one of our friends or something. And it's like, nope, you see them in one dungeon, and then 4 levels later, their candidate drops out, and now they're buddies again, and we all work together and save the world again for like the nth time. So just meh, you know. Some of the characters, well, most of the characters are generally good, but some of them start off as like the most comic book evil villain people, which again, when you compare it to villains like Thornton, or you compare it to even the Garleans or Emmett, you know, even the Endsinger is more interesting as a villain. They're just not that compelling. You know, unfortunately, a lot of their motivations just boil down to like heinous evil, and that's just not really that fun to fight against, right? I'm gonna be brave and not save this. Hopefully I don't have to re-record anything. But yeah, I mean, I think those are sort of my closing thoughts. I don't want to drag this out any longer than it already is. I'm sure this video is way too long already. Man, I'm having so much fun actually playing the game. I've never had this much fun just playing the game. You know, I feel like leveling everything has been a joy. The cities are so cool. The areas are so fun. The content is so engaging. I'm loving it. You know, I'm loving the game. But the story, man, was just... it just wasn't it. I don't know what else to say. So that's how I'm feeling. Let me know in the comments if you agree. If you disagree, I'm sure they'll be very civil. If they're not, I would prefer if they were. And let me know what you think. And I think that's it for this one. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.